The Pope was offended, but it was not really because of this astonishing reception in which the mere honors due to a temporal sovereign had been paid, to the exclusion of all recognition of him as the supreme pontiff and head of the Catholic Church, while every possible breach of papal etiquette had been committed, as though on purpose, but because he had just heard from Josephine herself that she was not married, and the announcement had excited his most intense surprise. The Pope saw the trap into which he was walking, and he could only suspect Napoleon of having set it for him. It was bad enough that Napoleon's concubine should have been presented to him as his lawful wife when she was in reality outside the laws of the church and living in deadly sin, that he had been induced to write to this woman flattering letters in which he had recognized her as Empress of the French and his dear daughter in Jesus Christ, that he had recommended to her the protection of the Catholic Church, but to be as to give the most holy of the sacraments to her, the threefold unction with the precious chrism reserved for the priests and made of oil and balm, quia per oleum infusio gratiae, per balsam and odor bonci famci designatur. This indeed passed all bounds, and it was an avowal on the part of the very woman herself which had put him on his guard. He cared not to consider the reasons for this avowal, with what intention it was made, or to serve what purpose. The fact was certain, and that was sufficient. Napoleon was warned that the Pope would not take part in the ceremony of the coronation unless proof were given him that the sacrament of marriage had been administered to the imperial couple. What was Napoleon to do? Break off negotiations and proceed to the civil coronation while the Pope was still staying in Paris? That would set all Europe laughing and put him in the ridiculous position of having tried to deceive the Supreme Pontiff and failed. It would scandalize all the clergy and Catholics by informing them that the author of the Concordat was sharing his bed and throne with a woman who is not his wife. Napoleon's reasons for omitting to have his marriage blessed by the church would not bear publication. They sprang from many ideas which were seething in his brain yet were repulsive to his heart, and which the uncertainty about his physical capacity caused to be suspected by him. To reveal the secret was impossible. He had continually refused to submit to a religious marriage, but was now driven into it by his respect for, if not belief in, a religion which he was unwilling to profane. At Montebello, in general command of the army of Italy, he had obliged his sisters Elise and Paulette, in spite of his own personal risk, to be married to Bacciocchi and Leclerc according to the rights of the church. If the news of this had got abroad, he would have run the risk of being recalled and stripped of his command, or something worse. When consul at Paris, he desired his brother Louis and his sister Caroline to be religiously married to Hortense and Murat. Apparently then he believed in the virtue and efficacy of the sacrament of marriage, and that only a religious marriage was binding and valid. But in all these four marriages, Josephine had been present at his side. Never for an instant had he the thought entered his mind of asking the priest who had officiated at the union of his brothers and sisters to perform the same office for himself and Josephine. He had never intended a divorce, but he reserved the power of procuring one. He desired the bond to be so loose that it could be untied at will. Life had prospered with him. His destiny had become great. The woman was dear to him. He loved her, believed her useful, and continued to find her desirable. He was grateful for all that she had taught him of the world and for the society into which she had introduced him. His glory had begun with and through her, and he was melted by her tears. He had carried her unwittingly with him in his marvelous ascent to the heights on which he now stood. He was quite willing to share with her his crown and throne, but he did not desire to pledge to her his whole future, and it was his future that the Pope demanded for her, not for her own sake, but because of the unalterable laws of the Church on this point. No diplomacy could persuade, no high-handedness compel, nothing could avail against the non-posthumous. He perceived this, and entering Paris with the Pope on the 7th Frimaire, he received from Fesch, who had been supplied with papal dispensations, the sacrament of marriage on the 9th. Fesch bore witness his marriage to the Pope and gave a certificate of it to Josephine. Thus was Napoleon compelled to give in on a question which he had very much at heart. He was forced into a marriage which he had formerly avoided, not because it would irrevocably settle his future, but because it offended his conscience. For he felt that a wife in the sight of God, should possess a purity and maidenliness of soul and body such as could not be looked for in Josephine. On other points, the struggle with the Pope was renewed from the 7th of Frimaire to the 11th under conditions which explain and justify the bitterness felt by the vanquished against the conqueror. The question of the ceremonial was under discussion. We have seen in what way Pertallus, the philosophic Christian, acting as minister of public worship, had proposed to revise the Roman service and bring it into line with the thought of the age. He had found it expedient to draw upon a new ritual, majestic, imposing, and modern, drawn partly from the ceremonies prescribed by Rome and partly from those customary at Rheims. But a committee at least was necessary for such work on Buceros, not the Cardinal of Rouen, but Arch-Chancellor and Ségur, Grand Master of the ceremonies, who had formerly been refused as ambassador of Rome, were scarcely competent to take their places on it, but to them were added the Abbé de Prat and probably Monsieur de Talleyrand, whose capability was less doubtful. In spite of such associates and many other doubtless, the work was not so easy as Pertallus had imagined, even when, as regards to the French ritual, they had procured the schooling of the chapter of Notre Dame by the clergy of the Cathedral of Saint-Remy. It was only to find that it was absolutely inapplicable to the founder of the Fourth Dynasty. Every detail of the traditional ceremony recalled the sovereigns of the Third House and bore witness of their method of government, the institutions which he had created or accepted, and the laws which they had made. The ceremony removed from Reims and applied to a person who had no connection with Hugh Capet would be nothing but a parody. Even for the lawful sedents of the Capetian house, the tradition was broken, could never be renewed. It consisted of observances which were only worthy of respect because they had been continuously performed from the earliest ages on the same spot and by men of the same family. They were the customary rites, and the omittance of them would have been a surprise and a shock. But if for some cause or another they should be omitted for a single generation, their virtue would vanish. The atmosphere once favorable would be dispelled, and in place of reverence they would be greeted with laughter.